Well, I just gave a long explanation of this subject that I want to talk about now, which is what does Aristotle mean by political science? What's translated as political science? But then I discovered that I clicked on the photographs thing and not the video. So I'm going to not necessarily repeat what I said, but I'm going to answer the question again, perhaps better than I did before. I don't know. And I'm going to take my glasses off because I noticed that because these transition lenses allow close-up look here, it makes you end up looking like this rather than like this, because then it's out of focus. So if I'm going to be out of focus, I might as well take the glasses off. And anyway, why am I speaking to myself? I've got a picture of myself here. So political science. Okay. So let's avoid question begging, and that is, the Greek word is politikē, where politikē is an adjective originally, but it came to become a noun. The adjective was modifying the noun, either techne or episteme. And both of those mean either art or science. They're largely interchangeable, despite what some people might say. You really don't need to distinguish and say, well, techne means craft and episteme means science. No, there's basically a notion of art or science or skill that is general, similar to art in the older sense in the English language and science in an older sense in the English language, where you would say it's something is a martial art or military science, with art and science meaning roughly the same thing. So there's this thing of politikē techne or politikē episteme, meaning the same thing, but it became a habit in ancient Greeks to take anything that ended with a feminine ending, an adjective with a feminine ending, so politikē or rhetorikē, and you would no longer have to use the substantive, the noun. It would be implied that it was techne. It would either be a techne, episteme, the same thing. It's all roughly the same thing, and you wouldn't need to use the second word. And so then, in that sense, these adjectives with the feminine ending, ek endings, came to be, in effect, nouns. So politikē is the normal way to say political science, even though it's, in a sense, short for politikē techne or politikē episteme. And now the question is political, because it's in Greek, it's not in English. And one has to remember, when you were learning French or whatever, they keep talking about false friends. So just because a word looks the same in French and English doesn't mean the English word has the same meaning as the French word, or the French word. So it says it's politikē in English and in Greek, and it is pretty normal to translate as political, but let's just make sure we're not assuming things. So I used to think that politikē was derived from polis. Polis is the Greek word for a very common method of arranging a society in Greece that was, I guess, pretty much unique to the Greeks, ancient Greece, like 500s, 400s, 300s BC, 200s. And so even though there was an area that was called Hellas, or Greece, including a bunch of colonies, it was to a large extent divided up into these little, what we might call city-states. There were also some things that were called ethne, or an ethnos, and that's where areas where it was a people, or it's the origin of the ethnic group. So there were parts of Greece that didn't have a little polis, but were a larger bunch of people living in an area which may have had some loose political organization. But the characteristic Greek way of running things was in these city-states, but there were city-states in the following sense. There was an urban center, like Athens or Sparta, but there was also a rural area around it where people did the farming and whatnot. So there was, so it was a city. It wasn't just a city; it was a city but it was a fairly small area compared to what we think of as countries now, and compared to the ethne, the ethnos. So compared to Persia, say, or Egypt, Athens, or Attica, and Sparta or Laconia. Laconia? Yeah. Those were fairly small areas, but they were a political community, so they can be compared to countries. But all this notion of political is in Aristotle elsewhere is based on these arrangements, and these things were called polis, P-O-L-I-S, plural polis, P-O-L-E-I-S. So they were. This was a polis. When you read Aristotle in English, traditionally that was translated as the state. Now in England, the word the state has a slightly different feeling than it does in North America. But then it was translated as city-state, and sometimes just translated as city. So, but you had to understand it had this special meaning. Anyway, the question is, if you read the ethics, like the Nicomachean ethics, or for that matter, the Eudemian ethics, but the ethics, well, particularly the Nicomachean ethics, although they overlap, you might be a bit surprised when near the very beginning it talks about how that there are these various arts or sciences that exist in the world, and that some of them exist for the sake of others, and that there was a hierarchy, and that the supreme science is Politikē. Politikē techne, Politikē ekne. So usually translated political science. So you might say, wait a second, here I am reading this book supposedly on ethics, which is actually a mistranslation of the title, because the title is Ethika, and Ethika is related to the word ethe, which means character traits or character. So it's actually a book on character, not a book on ethics. But anyway, in that book where it is discussing loosely ethical things, you suddenly are being told that the supreme knower of the good is this political science, and you might think, wait, how did that happen? I mean, what about philosophy? What about theology, and so on? Anyway, so that the question is, what is political science? What does Aristotle mean by political science? And the answer to the puzzle is that the ethike is concerned about human happiness, and according to Aristotle, human happiness is only possible if you live virtuously. People translate it as in accordance with virtue, which doesn't make a lot of sense, because what does it mean in accordance with? But anyway, you live from virtue, and so to be happy, apparently, you have to have virtue. And virtue in this case means things like courage or bravery or fortitude, so that when there's some difficult task, including fighting in a good cause, you have the strength of character to go forward with it. You're not afraid and you run away. And another character virtue is temperance, self-control, so that you're not at the mercy of all your desires, physical desires. You have some self-control. And then the third one is, I'm talking in terms of cardinal virtues. I mean, this is not Aristotle's term, but it's the justice is a virtue. And what that means is, as a virtue, is something like you give each person their due. So if that belongs to you, I respect the fact that is yours. And if I've borrowed something, then I have a natural tendency to return it. If I owe you money, I pay you back. And also, you even things like showing gratitude to your parents. So so justice has to do with giving each person his due, and understood as a character trait, as a virtue. Justice as an abstract way of dividing things up is related, but it's a separate issue. And then there's an intellectual virtue that is connected to these, and that's called prudence or wisdom or practical wisdom. And in Aristotle's view, you can't really be a fully virtuous person if you don't have wisdom together with these character virtues. But you can't really be wise if you don't also have the character virtues. So they're, but if you need to know when to be brave and to go forward and attack, that requires some wisdom. So you're not just doing it willy-nilly. Same thing, when to resist the satisfaction of a desire, that requires some wisdom, and to know what belongs to whom, and what you should do with respect to other people, that requires wisdom. Now, so the goal of the highest good in the subject of ethics of the character virtues, of the subject of the Nicomachean ethics is the production of human happiness. The human happiness requires that you have good character, because happiness, according to Aristotle, comes from living in accordance with virtue. Well, kata arete. Now, strictly speaking, despite the fact that everybody translates it that way, living in accordance with virtue doesn't make a lot of sense. So I would say it essentially means living virtuously, or acting from virtue. And so you can't be happy if you don't have virtue, and also if you don't act. So then the question is, well, how is virtue produced? Is it through lectures? In Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, can virtue be taught or learnt? And according to Aristotle, character virtue comes on the basis of habit. And habit is engendered through a socialization process in which the constitution, that is the overall organization of the society, and its laws consistent with that constitution, create an environment that habituate people in a certain way of behaving, and also the educational system that would be set up. So the public policy person, the politician, the statesman, the political scientist, the person in charge of the city, who was supposed to look out for the welfare of the citizens, the politai, one citizen's a polites, that person has to concern himself with creating an arrangement, constitution, political system, and laws that are going to socialize people virtuously, to be virtuous. I see somebody's. That's why it's the primary concern of political science, of anybody who's concerned with happiness and how to generate it. That task falls primarily largely to political science as the supreme science that must know the ultimate goal so that it can create political systems and laws that are going to achieve that goal. So that's why the Aristotle's political science, Politikē, is spread across primarily two books. That is the Ethics, Part 1, and the Politics, Part 2. So the Ethics is telling you what the goal is, and the Politics is discussing how to achieve the goal. So once you've established that what virtue is and how it's achieved in theory, then in the Politics we discuss various ways of arranging the city and various ways of making laws that are more likely to achieve the goal of making happy people. So that's why it says early on that political science is the supreme science, the architectonike, that is to say, the science that is ruling other sciences. So, like an architect is, in a general sense of architect, has the big plan for the city and for the building, goes there and then employs various craftsmen to, make a foundation, build this up, put in windows. And so each craftsman doesn't necessarily understand the big picture, but he gets directions from the architecton, the master builder or the architect, about what to do. And then finally, between them, they create a building. So political science in Aristotle is given this sort of role of being the architectonic science. That is the science that knows within a city how many other sciences you need and gives them direction. So that would require some explanation about the notion of a hierarchy of sciences. Also, the other thing is to raise the question is, well, wait a second, isn't philosophy the highest science? What about theology? And that would require some discussion, maybe in another video. Philosophy and theology. What is the relationship between political science and philosophy and theology, on the assumption there is a God and that there is a subject to have a science about, but which Aristotle actually did think. So, but why is political science the supreme science in charge of the ultimate good, and not these other things? I mean, especially if you've read Plato, you might wonder, wait a second, what happened to philosophy? And there is an answer to that question, and it's somewhat relevant because actually, what Aristotle says is that the highest human happiness, yes, it comes from living virtuously, but the highest virtue is actually not one of these cardinal virtues, but it's another virtue called Sophia. Sophia is normally translated wisdom, but since wisdom sounds more like what phronesis or prudence is, it's often called theoretical wisdom by contrast with practical wisdom. And so Aristotle has what might seem a very intellectualist notion of human happiness, but so then what is the connection between everything we've said so far about the character virtues and practical wisdom or prudence, and this other thing? So I will address that in another video. And this time I actually did record it, so I will. Oh, but here's another point. These subjects are discussed in more detail in written form with citations in my writings that you can find on the web at the following place. It's a general thing called academia.edu, but to get to my particular place in that, you would have to type chicago.academia.edu / my name, which is PaulBullen, and Bullen is spelled B like in boy, ULLEN, like Anne Bullen, but the way Shakespeare spelled it. So Chicago, like the city, .academia.edu, as in education, edu, / PaulBullen, PaulBullen, chicago.academia.edu / PaulBullen. So then you can read, if you go there and you choose the section, there's a section called Ancient Political Science, and also there's a section called The Three Dimensions of Aristotle's Political Ideology, and there are sections of outlines of Aristotle And so that the most direct place to go to is the section called Ancient Political Science, and you can read up on this, find out where you can see it in the actual texts of Aristotle. And also I explain the origins of these ideas in Plato and how Plato is reacting to the sophists. So that's all very interesting, and that is provided in great detail with many citations. So have a good day.